Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care.
The alien city of Xanathra stood like a titan against the crimson skies. Towering spires of organic structures twisted and melded with the massive trees native to the planet, their vines wrapping around buildings in a delicate yet powerful embrace. The Thrishan people were as formidable as their architecture, tall, strong, and utterly devoted to tradition. Elias Carter, a human diplomat from Earth, stood at the edge of the Grand Thrishan Palace, gazing out over the breathtaking view of their bioorganic city. He had been on Xanathra for nearly 6 months, tasked with forging a fragile peace treaty between the humans and the Thrishans. But peace was not the only thing on his mind. His thoughts kept drifting to Circala, the chieftain's daughter, an imposing Thrishan warrior. Every time he saw her, whether it was during negotiations or passing through the palace, his heart raced. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, standing over 8 feet tall, with a muscular build and fierce, glowing eyes. Circala was a force of nature. Her every movement exuded strength, and yet there was something more, something softer, more human, in the way she carried herself when no one was looking. He couldn't help but admire her, though he knew such thoughts were dangerous. The Thrishans had strict laws regarding cross-species relations. To them, humans were fragile creatures, barely worthy of sharing the same table, let alone anything more intimate. Elias, as a human diplomat, was already seen as a curiosity, but to pursue feelings for a Thrishan woman, especially someone of Circala's status, was unthinkable. Yet here he was, standing at the threshold of forbidden desires. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look troubled, human." Elias turned, his heart skipping a beat as Circala approached. She moved with the grace of a predator, her long strides effortlessly carrying her closer until she loomed over him. Her armor clinked softly, and her piercing violet eyes locked onto his. "I was just admiring the view," Elias said, clearing his throat. Circala's gaze followed his, out toward the city. "It's magnificent, isn't it? Our people have lived here for thousands of years, surviving everything the universe has thrown at us. But you, humans, you've only just begun to explore the stars, and yet you're here, standing beside us." Elias smiled, though her words carried a weight he couldn't shake. "We're adaptable. It's in our nature to push boundaries." "Adaptable." Circala repeated the word, her voice tinged with something like amusement. "Your people have spirit. I can see why my father tolerates these negotiations. But it's dangerous to push too far." There it was again, that hint of something more beneath the surface. Elias found himself captivated by her. Not just her strength, but the vulnerability he sensed hidden deep within. "I've never been one to shy away from danger," Elias said, his eyes meeting hers. A flicker of something passed through her gaze. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, yet Elias didn't flinch. If anything, he felt drawn to her even more. The unspoken tension between them had been building for weeks, ever since their first encounter in the palace halls. There had always been an invisible line neither dared cross, until now. "You're either brave or foolish, Elias Carter," Circala said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "But I can't decide which." "Maybe I'm a bit of both," he replied, his heart pounding. He was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something he couldn't turn away from. Circala studied him for a moment longer before turning her gaze back to the city. "This alliance, it means everything to my people. But alliances can be fragile. There are those who would see it broken if it meant protecting our traditions." Her words hung heavy in the air, and Elias understood the deeper meaning. Tradition was everything to the Thrishans, and their laws on interspecies relationships were strict. What he was feeling for her was more than just forbidden. It was potentially catastrophic. But as he stood there, with Circala so close, the scent of her, the raw power of her presence, Elias realized that he didn't care. He had crossed the stars to be here, to make something new out of the impossible. And now, standing at the precipice of something forbidden, he knew that turning back was no longer an option. "I understand what's at stake," Elias said, his voice steady. but I think some things are worth risking everything for. Sakala looked at him sharply, her eyes narrowing. You don't know what you're saying, human. Maybe I don't, Elias admitted, but I know what I feel. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them both. Then, with a final glance toward the city, Sakala stepped back. You should leave now, she said, her voice unreadable, before you push too far. Elias hesitated but finally nodded. I'll see you at the next negotiation. Sakala didn't respond, and as Elias walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if he had just taken the first step towards something far more dangerous than diplomacy. The following weeks passed in a blur of tense negotiations and quiet moments where Elias and Sakala exchanged glances, their connection deepening despite the distance they tried to maintain. The fragile peace between the humans and Thriscians teetered on the edge of collapse, with both sides pressing their own agendas. But it wasn't just politics that weighed heavily on Elias' mind. His every interaction with Sakala left him more conflicted, torn between his duty as a diplomat and the unspoken bond growing between them. He could feel it every time her eyes lingered on him, every time their hands brushed accidentally during meetings. It was a quiet storm building between them, one neither could ignore for much longer. A diplomatic mission was soon arranged. Elias and Sakala were chosen to represent their people in delicate negotiations with a rogue faction of Thriscians. These rebels opposed any form of alliance with humans, preferring isolation and adherence to the old ways. The mission was dangerous, and their success or failure could dictate the future of the entire peace treaty. As they left the main city and traveled deeper into the Thriscian wilderness, Elias found himself alone with Sakala for the first time in weeks. The journey took them through dense forests and craggy mountains, where the sky was blotted out by towering trees, and the air was thick with the scent of alien flora. They camped under the stars that night, far from the city lights. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on Sakala's face, making her seem even more mysterious and untouchable. Elias stared into the flames, struggling to suppress the turmoil inside him. But being so close to her, out in the wilderness, away from the watchful eyes of the Thriscian elite, made it harder to maintain control. Sakala broke the silence first. You're quiet tonight, human. Elias glanced up, meeting her gaze across the fire. Her violet eyes gleamed in the firelight, sharp and penetrating. Just thinking, he said. About what? She asked, her tone curious, but guarded. Elias hesitated, unsure if he should reveal the truth. He had been taught to keep his emotions in check, to prioritize diplomacy over personal desires. But out here, with Sakala's presence overwhelming him, those rules seemed distant and irrelevant. About how different things are between our people, he finally said, though the weight of his real thoughts pressed at the back of his mind. Sakala tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Different, yes. Your people are unpredictable and small. Elias chuckled, a sound that surprised him as much as it did her. We may be small, but we've survived out there in the stars, just like you. You are resilient, she admitted. That is something I admire. Elias' heart skipped a beat at her admission. It was rare for Thriscians, especially one of Sakala's stature, to openly express admiration for a human. He searched her face for signs of sarcasm, but there was none. Her words were genuine. You admire us? Elias asked, cautiously probing deeper. Sakala nodded, her gaze unwavering. There is strength in resilience, even if it is not the same kind of strength we value. Your people push forward despite the odds, always reaching for something more. I've seen it in you as well. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken meaning. Elias knew he was standing on dangerous ground, but he couldn't stop himself. The pull toward her was undeniable. And what about you? Elias asked, his voice quieter now. What do you want, Sakala? Sakala's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Elias saw something vulnerable beneath her stoic exterior. What I want doesn't matter, she said, her voice hard, as though she were convincing herself as much as him. It does to me, Elias countered, standing and moving around the fire to sit beside her. He felt the heat radiating off her skin, her presence a mix of strength and restraint. You're not like the others. I've seen it in the way you act, the way you think. You're different. Sakala turned her head, her gaze locking onto his. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, and the distance between them felt smaller than ever. Elias' heart raced as he felt her intense focus shift toward him, not as a Thracian warrior, but as something more, something deeply personal. I am different, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But that difference makes me a danger to my people. Or a strength, Elias said, reaching out to place a hand on her arm. The moment his fingers touched her, a spark of electricity seemed to jump between them, igniting a flood of emotions he had kept at bay for too long. Sakala looked down at his hand, and for a brief second, Elias thought she might push him away, laugh off the moment as a foolish human mistake. But she didn't. Instead, her massive hand slowly closed over his, engulfing it completely. Yet her touch was gentle. You're a fool, she whispered, though her voice was softer now, almost pained. Maybe, Elias agreed, his heart pounding. But I don't care. Sakala's grip tightened, and she pulled him closer, her face inches from his. The scent of her skin was intoxicating, a mix of earth and something primal. And for a moment, all Elias could think about was how close she was, how much he wanted her. You don't know what you're asking for, Elias Carter, Sakala said, her voice low and warning. To take me as a mate, it's forbidden. You would risk everything. I know, Elias said, his voice unwavering. And I'm willing. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Sakala released his hand and stood, her towering figure casting a long shadow over him. This can't happen, she said, her voice hard again. Not here. Not now. Elias stood too, unwilling to let the moment pass. Then when Sakala stared down at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and something deeper, something Elias recognized all too well. I don't know, she finally said, but I can't deny it anymore. With that, she turned and walked into the darkness, leaving Elias alone by the fire, his heart still pounding, his thoughts racing with the knowledge that what had started as a quiet desire had now become something impossible to ignore. The journey continued the next day in strained silence. Elias and Sakala walked side by side through the dense forests of Xanathra, their unspoken feelings hanging in the air like a thick fog. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and in those brief moments, Elias saw something in Sakala that both terrified and exhilarated him, desire. But the tension between them was not just emotional. It was also cultural, perhaps even spiritual. The landscape around them grew more hostile as they neared the rebel Thracian outpost. The trees became gnarled, their branches twisting like claws toward the sky, and the once vibrant foliage dulled to a sickly shade of gray. They camped again that night, preparing to meet the Thracian rebels at dawn for negotiations. The weight of the mission pressed down on Elias, but even more so, the weight of his feelings for Sakala. As they sat around the fire, the silence between them became unbearable. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice soft but steady. We can't keep pretending this doesn't exist. Sakala glanced at him, her expression guarded. What are you talking about? You know what I mean, Elias said, turning to face her fully. This thing between us, it's not just in my head, is it? For a moment, Sakala didn't answer. Her gaze was distant, as if she were weighing a decision that could alter the course of her life. Then, slowly, she shook her head. No, it's not just in your head. The admission hung between them, heavy and charged. Elias felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived as Sakala's expression darkened. But it can't happen, she said, her voice low. You know that, if my people find out, if my father finds out. Elias leaned closer, his heart pounding. Why does it have to be like this? Why should it matter? We're just two people who... We're not just two people, Sakala interrupted, her voice sharp. I am Thracian. You are human. Our union would be seen as a betrayal to my people, to everything I've been taught to uphold. Elias' frustration boiled over. So what? You're supposed to deny how you feel for the rest of your life. You're supposed to live according to rules that don't even make sense. Sakala's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elias thought he had gone too far. But then, something in her expression softened, and she looked away, her voice quieter now. It's not just about me. My people. They expect me to uphold our traditions, to choose a mate who will strengthen our bloodline. Choosing a human would be seen as weakness. Elias shook his head, feeling the injustice of it all. And what about what you want? What if what's best for your people isn't about following tradition, but about breaking it? Sakala stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You don't understand. Thriscians are not like humans. We're bound by honor, by laws that have kept us strong for thousands of years. To break them would mean exile, or worse. Elias stood, pacing around the fire, his mind racing. He couldn't accept this. He couldn't accept that something so powerful between them had to be denied because of arbitrary rules. We could leave, he said suddenly, the idea forming even as he spoke. We could leave all of this behind. Your people, my people. They don't have to control our lives. Sakala looked up at him, her eyes filled with conflict. Leave? And go where? We'd be hunted. There would be no peace for us. Elias knelt beside her, his voice urgent. I don't care. I'd rather live on the run with you than spend the rest of my life regretting what could have been. Sakala's breath hitched, and for the first time, Elias saw a crack in her armor. She was torn, not just between her duty and her desire, but between the life she had always known and the unknown future he was offering. You don't know what you're asking, she whispered. I know exactly what I'm asking, Elias replied, his voice steady. I'm asking you to choose what's right for you. Not for your people, not for your father, just for you. Sakala closed her eyes, her massive frame trembling as she fought against the emotions that had been building between them for so long. Elias reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they stayed like that, the fire crackling between them, their world shrinking to just the two of them. Then, slowly, Sakala leaned into his touch, her eyes opening to meet his. If we do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, there's no going back. I don't want to go back, Elias said, his heart racing. I want to go forward with you. And then, in the flickering firelight, Sakala made her decision. She reached out, her hand grasping the back of his neck, and pulled him to her. Their lips met in a fierce, desperate kiss, all the tension and desire that had been building between them finally exploding into reality. Elias wrapped his arms around her, feeling the strength of her body against his, the heat of her skin beneath his fingers. Sakala's kiss was wild and passionate, and yet there was a tenderness there, too, a vulnerability that she had never shown anyone before. They pulled apart, breathless, staring at each other in the dim light of the fire. The air between them crackled with intensity, and for a moment, the world outside their small camp ceased to exist. Sakala stood, her towering figure silhouetted against the stars, and she reached out a hand to him. Come with me. Elias took her hand, feeling the rough calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. She led him away from the fire, into the darkness of the forest, where the trees rose high above them like silent sentinels. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of alien creatures in the distance, but all Elias could hear was the pounding of his own heart. They found a secluded spot beneath the towering branches, where the canopy blocked out the sky, leaving them in a world of shadows. Sakala turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. This is forbidden, she whispered, her voice filled with both fear and excitement. I know, Elias whispered back, stepping closer. But it doesn't matter. Not tonight. And with that, they came together once more, their bodies entwining in the darkness. It was a union born of desperation and defiance, of passion and rebellion. Elias felt the power of Sakala's strength, but also her vulnerability. and he reveled in the fact that she had chosen him, against all odds, against everything she had been taught. The night stretched on, their world reduced to the warmth of their bodies, the softness of their breaths, the rhythm of their hearts beating in unison. It was a moment of impossible desire, of crossing the line they had both been too afraid to acknowledge. When the morning light began to filter through the trees, they lay together, their arms wrapped around each other. Sakala's head rested on his chest, her body curled protectively around him, and for the first time, Elias felt truly at peace. But as the dawn broke, reality crept back in. The consequences of their actions were inevitable, and Elias knew that their forbidden night had changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the towering trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Elias stirred beneath the weight of Sakala's arm, her body still wrapped protectively around him. For a brief moment, he felt a strange sense of peace, as though the world outside their secluded bubble didn't exist. But reality came crashing back quickly. As the haze of sleep lifted, the enormity of what they had done hit him like a tidal wave. Their union had been passionate and wild, but it had also broken every law of Thrishan society. Elias knew that if they were discovered, the consequences would be dire. Not just for him, but for Sakala as well. He shifted, trying to extricate himself from her embrace without waking her. But Sakala was a warrior, and even in her sleep, she was attuned to the slightest movements. Her eyes snapped open, their violet glow piercing in the morning light. "We need to go," Elias whispered, his voice filled with urgency. "If anyone finds us here." Sakala sat up, her expression unreadable. She knew better than anyone the risks they had taken, but there was no regret in her eyes. "We'll leave soon," she said, her voice steady. "But not yet." Elias looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Sakala stood, her towering figure casting a shadow over him as she stretched. "There's no point in running, Elias. The Thrishans will know. My father will know. We can't hide this." Panic welled up in Elias' chest. "Then what do we do?" Sakala turned to face him, her expression calm and resolute. "We face it, together." Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. The thought of standing before the Thrishan chieftain, Sakala's father, after what had happened sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't afraid for himself, not really. He was afraid for her, for the punishment she might face for breaking the sacred laws of her people. "Sakala, if your father finds out." "He will find out," she interrupted, her tone firm. "And when he does, I will take responsibility." Elias shook his head, rising to his feet. "No, we both made this choice. I won't let you face the consequences alone." Sakala's eyes softened, and for a moment, the fierce warrior he had come to know seemed vulnerable, almost fragile. "You're a fool, Elias Carter," she said softly. "But you're my fool." Elias stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we face it side by side." She squeezed his hand tightly, her strength and warmth grounding him in the moment. For a brief second, Elias allowed himself to believe that they could survive this, that maybe, just maybe, the bond they had forged would be enough to withstand the storm that was surely coming. But that hope was short-lived. As they made their way back toward the rebel outpost, the sound of rustling leaves and heavy footsteps reached their ears. Elias froze, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side. Sakala, too, went still, her keen senses alerting her to the presence of others. They weren't alone. Before either of them could react, a group of Thrishan warriors emerged from the trees, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. They were led by a towering figure, General Varric, Sakala's older brother and second-in-command to their father. His violet eyes blazed with fury as they landed on Elias and Sakala standing together. Too close, too familiar. "You!" Varric's voice was a low growl, filled with disbelief and rage. "You dare defile our bloodline with this human filth?" Elias tensed, his hand hovering over his weapon, but Sakala stepped forward, placing herself between him and her brother. "Varric," she said calmly, though there was a steely edge to her voice. "This is not your concern." Varric's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Serkala and Elias. "Not my concern? You've broken our most sacred laws, Serkala. You've brought shame to our family, to our people." Elias could feel the tension building, and he knew this situation could escalate into violence at any moment. He had seen the intensity of Thrishan honor before, but now it was personal, dangerously so. "We can explain," Elias said, stepping forward, but Varric's glare silenced him. "There is nothing to explain," Varric snarled. "You're a human, an outsider. You have no place here." Serkala's hand shot out, grabbing Varric's arm before he could draw his weapon. "Stop," she commanded, her voice firm. "This is my decision, my choice." Varric wrenched his arm free, his eyes flashing with betrayal. "And it's the wrong choice, sister. You've doomed us all with your weakness." Serkala's expression hardened. "If choosing to follow my heart is weakness, then I will bear that burden. But do not think you can pass judgment on me, Varric. I am still your sister." Varric's lips curled into a sneer. "Not for much longer." Before anyone could react, Varric turned on his heel and stormed off, his warriors following in his wake. The message was clear. Serkala and Elias were no longer under his protection. Whatever fate awaited them would be decided by her father, the chieftain of the Thrishans. Elias exhaled, the tension slowly leaving his body, though the fear remained. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Serkala stared after her brother, her expression unreadable. "Now we go back," she said, her voice steady but distant, "and we face whatever judgment my father deems fit." Elias nodded, though a pit of dread formed in his stomach. The path ahead was dangerous, filled with uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. They had crossed the line, and there was no undoing what had been done. As they made their way back toward the city, Elias couldn't help but wonder if they had already sealed their fate. The journey back to the Thrishan capital was heavy with silence. Elias could feel the weight of what was to come pressing down on him like a physical force. Serkala walked beside him, her expression stoic, but Elias could sense the tension in her rigid posture. She was preparing for what lay ahead, knowing that her choice to stand with him had irrevocably altered the course of her life. When they finally reached the grand gates of the capital, the air was thick with anticipation. Word had spread quickly. Elias could see it in the eyes of every Thrishan they passed. Whispers followed them through the streets as they made their way toward the great hall, where Serkala's father, Chieftain Morak, awaited them. The hall was a massive, cavernous structure carved into the heart of the oldest tree in the city. Its walls were adorned with the ancient symbols of Thrishan strength and honor, and the very air inside seemed to hum with the weight of centuries of tradition. Elias had been here many times before, during the peace talks, but now the place felt colder, more foreboding. As they entered, a hush fell over the gathered crowd of Thrishan elders, warriors, and advisors. All eyes were on them, on Elias, the human outsider who had dared to challenge the sacred laws of the Thrishans, and on Serkala, the chieftain's daughter, who had defied her people's expectations. Chieftain Morak sat at the head of the room, his massive figure draped in ceremonial robes, his face etched with deep lines of age and authority. His violet eyes, the same as Serkala's, were dark and filled with a quiet, simmering rage. Varric stood to his father's right, his expression a twisted mask of betrayal and satisfaction. He had clearly wasted no time informing their father of what had transpired. "Serkala," Chieftain Morak's voice boomed through the hall, the tone sharp and unforgiving. "Step forward." Serkala obeyed without hesitation, her head held high as she moved to stand before her father. Elias followed closely, refusing to let her face this alone. "You have disgraced our family," Morak continued, his voice low and dangerous. "You have defied the laws of our people, broken the sacred bonds of tradition. And for what? A human?" His gaze flicked to Elias, filled with disdain. "A weak, inferior creature not fit to walk among us." Elias remained silent, standing tall, despite the burning shame that Morak's words ignited in him. He had known this confrontation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Circala's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. I made my choice, Father. I chose Elias not out of weakness, but out of strength. Morak's eyes narrowed. Strength? You call this strength? You've thrown away your honor, your future, for the fleeting desires of a lesser being. You have brought shame to our bloodline. I have brought no shame, Circala countered, her voice rising with conviction. I chose to follow my heart, to forge my own path. Isn't that what you taught me? To be strong, to stand by my choices, no matter the cost? The tension in the room was palpable. The elders shifted uncomfortably, while Varric's sneer deepened. Morak leaned forward in his chair, his gaze boring into his daughter's. And what of the consequences, Circala? Have you considered the price of your defiance? You will be exiled, stripped of your title, your place in our people's history erased. Is that the future you want? Circala's jaw tightened, but she did not falter. If that is the price for choosing what I believe is right, then I will pay it. Elias' heart ached at her words, but there was also a fierce pride swelling in his chest. Circala's strength was undeniable, and he knew now more than ever that she was unlike any warrior, any leader he had ever known. She was willing to risk everything, her status, her legacy, for a truth she could not deny. Morak sat back, his eyes cold and calculating. And you, human, he said, turning his gaze to Elias. What do you say to this? You have corrupted my daughter, led her down a path of ruin. Why should I not have you executed where you stand? The threat hung heavy in the air, but Elias did not waver. He stepped forward, meeting Morak's gaze with a steady resolve. I didn't come here to take anything from your daughter or your people. I came to build something new. I didn't expect to fall in love with Circala, but I won't apologize for it. She is the strongest person I've ever known, and I will stand by her, no matter the consequences. A murmur spread through the gathered Thracians, but Elias didn't care. His focus was on Circala and the unwavering bond they shared. He had never felt more certain of anything in his life. Morak studied him for a long, tense moment before rising to his full height, his massive figure towering over the hall. Your words are brave, human, but bravery will not save you from the judgment of this council. Circala took a step forward, her voice fierce. If you exile me, then let it be known that I stand by Elias. He is not my weakness. He is my strength. Together, we are stronger than the traditions that bind us. The room erupted into chaos as the elders and warriors argued amongst themselves. Some called for Circala's punishment, others for mercy. Morak stood silent, watching his daughter with an intensity that made Elias' skin crawl. He knew that this was more than just a decision about honor or tradition. This was a test of Morak's leadership, a test of what kind of future the Thracian people would embrace. Finally, Morak raised his hand, silencing the room. Enough! The hall fell quiet once more as he turned his gaze to Circala. You have chosen your path, daughter, and for that, you will face the consequences. You will be stripped of your title and exiled from our lands. You will have no claim to our people's legacy, no place among us. Elias felt the weight of the words settle heavily on his heart, but Circala remained defiant, her chin lifted high. Morak's gaze shifted to Elias. And you, human, you will leave this planet with her, never to return. Should either of you set foot on Thracian soil again, you will face death. Elias nodded, accepting the terms. There was no other choice. But before they could be dismissed, Morak stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. Remember this, Circala. You may walk away from this hall with your human, but you walk away with nothing else. You are no longer my daughter. Circala's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded. Understood. With that, the judgment was sealed. The bond between Circala and her people was broken, but the bond between her and Elias had never been stronger. The weight of exile pressed down on Elias and Circala as they left the great hall for the last time. The eyes of the Thracian people followed them, some filled with contempt, others with pity. Elias couldn't help but feel a surge of guilt for the consequences Circala had to endure, but the thought of her standing by his side, choosing him over everything she had known, filled him with a fierce determination. As they made their way out of the city, Sakala remained silent, her expression hard and unreadable. Elias wanted to comfort her, to offer some words of solace, but he knew that nothing he said could ease the pain of being cast out from her own people. This was a wound that only time and distance could heal. The wilderness beyond the city was vast and untamed, stretching out in all directions under the alien sky. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They could never return to the life they had known. They were bound together now. Two exiles, facing a world that was both dangerous and full of possibility. After hours of walking in silence, they finally stopped to rest. The trees around them stood tall and quiet, their branches swaying gently in the cool breeze. Sakala sat down on a fallen log, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Elias sat beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that they would be okay, that they would find a way to build a life together. But he wasn't sure if those words would bring comfort or only remind her of what she had lost. Finally, Sakala spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I knew this would happen." Elias turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I knew that choosing you would cost me everything," she continued, her gaze still fixed on the distance. "My title, my family, my place among my people. I've lost it all." Elias' heart ached at the raw pain in her voice. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry, Sakala. I never wanted this for you." Sakala squeezed his hand, her grip strong but reassuring. "Don't apologize, Elias. I made my choice, and I don't regret it." Her words were like a balm to his soul, but Elias still couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. "But your father—" "My father is a great leader," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "But he is bound by tradition, just like the rest of our people. He couldn't understand what we have, and that's his failure, not mine." Elias nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. "Where do we go from here?" Sakala finally turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We find our own path, away from the Thriscians, away from everything that tried to keep us apart." A small, hopeful smile tugged at Elias' lips. "You think we can do that?" Sakala's gaze softened, and for the first time since their exile, she allowed herself a faint smile. "We've already survived this much, haven't we? We'll figure it out." Elias chuckled, his heart lifting at the sight of her smile. "Yeah, we will." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the alien sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep purple and gold. It was a peaceful moment, one that reminded Elias of all the reasons he had fallen for Sakala in the first place. She was strong, unyielding, but there was a tenderness in her that he had been fortunate enough to witness. And now, she was his partner, in every sense of the word. As night fell, they set up a small camp beneath the towering trees. The stars above were strange and unfamiliar, but they brought a sense of comfort to Elias. It reminded him that the universe was vast, full of endless possibilities. Their exile was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. Sitting by the fire, Sakala leaned against him, her large frame resting comfortably beside his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand what this moment meant. They were together, and that was enough. Elias wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "So," he said, his voice light but sincere, "any idea where we're headed?" Sakala chuckled softly, a sound that warmed his heart. "Not a clue, but wherever it is, we'll make it ours." Elias smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "I like the sound of that." The fire crackled softly, and the night stretched on around them. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt a deep sense of contentment. He had lost many things, his status, his place among the humans as a diplomat, but in return, he had gained something far more valuable, a future with Sakala. They talked quietly for a while, about nothing in particular, shared stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. It was a conversation filled with warmth and laughter, a much-needed reprieve from the tension and danger they had faced. The world outside their small camp felt far away, and for a brief moment, Elias allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right. But deep down, he knew that their journey was far from over. The next morning, they set out once more, the wilderness stretching ahead of them like a blank canvas. They didn't know where they were headed, but that was part of the adventure. Together, they would carve out a place for themselves in a universe that had tried to keep them apart. As they walked, side by side, Elias couldn't help but smile. They were no longer bound by the traditions of their people, no longer trapped by expectations or fear. They were free, and as long as they had each other, that was all they needed.